Good morning, and thank you for tuning in. I lived for 8 years in Mexico, and there was a lot about living down there that changed and transformed my perspective, the way that I look at things. And one of the biggest, most life-changing things that I experienced while I was down there was just the ability to truly celebrate. It's probably no news to you that in Mexico and in Latin America, South America, parties aren't just parties, they are celebrations. And that was kind of a revelation to me. I didn't know the difference between just having a party and having a celebration, but I learned. Trust me, I learned what the difference was. And it took just one moment for me to be able to feel the difference. I had probably been to 3 or 4 either weddings or birthdays or quinceañeras in Mexico. A quinceañera is when a young woman turns 15 years old, and it's a very big deal there. I had probably been to a couple of these parties before, but I was very shy, very reluctant to dance and to join in the festivities, and even a little bit standoffish. Like, well, I'm not gonna dance. But I went to a quinceañera with Yasmin, and one of her cousins, her male cousins, asked her to dance. And because I wasn't dancing with her, she went and danced with one of her cousins. Well, all of a sudden, I decide, okay, if that's the way that it's going to be, then I better learn how to dance. I better do this. I better join in the celebration. And once I did, I don't know why I was scared to before. Why I felt like I was too good to before. Once I did, I realized that everybody else was just waiting for me to join in, to dance, to sing, to enjoy the food, to enjoy the whole atmosphere. And that's when I learned that true celebration only happens when you shed your inhibitions, when you take off your pretentiousness, when you no longer are so aware of yourself that it becomes this barrier. True celebration only happens when you're able to leave all that behind and you're able to just join into the life of the community, the life of the celebration. And so what I came to find out, and I truly believe now, is that the power of celebration is transformative. Celebration can change you. Celebration has the enormous power to affect change in our lives. It has the power to draw a community together. And it has the power to bring about this sort of cathartic release where you can sing and you can dance and you can enjoy things like food or music. And in that process, you are able to temporarily forget about the bad parts of life, the difficult parts of life, and you can focus on and enjoy and be grateful for those good times and those good things that obviously they come from God. And so why shouldn't they be celebrated? Why shouldn't we celebrate? You know, I love that Jesus' first miracle performed was changing water into wine. And I know that there's a huge, spiritual background to that. And there's this spiritual imagery that surrounds that miracle. And, the way that the water basins where the water was turned into wine, the way that those were used for, ritual purification, and how with Jesus, he changes the water to wine, and that kind of symbolizes that it's his blood that really purifies us. And so God has been saving the best for last by bringing Jesus and covering us with his blood, purifying us from all sins because of his sacrifice on the cross. Now that is beautiful imagery, but sometimes I think we forget just the reality that there's also the aspect that Jesus is just trying to keep the celebration alive. He's trying to keep the celebration of unity, of marriage. He's trying to keep that alive. And if the wine runs out, then not only is the party ruined, but the reputation of the bride and the bridegroom is ruined. And Jesus knows that celebrations are beautiful. And part of him, I think, just wants to keep it going. And the Bible is, it's filled with that kind of imagery of feasts and holy days, of celebrations and shouting and trumpets and joy. The Bible's filled with that kind of imagery because it was expected to be a part of the life of God's people. You were expected to enter into the act of celebration, not even just as an individual, but as a community. And so it was an important part of the life of God's people, both as Israelites, as Jews, but even in the New Testament. There's this emphasis on enjoying and giving thanks communally, as a community. And that is our celebration of God. It's our celebration of Jesus. Hence, why we take the Lord's Supper. So, my question is, do we know the power of celebration in our lives today? Do we recognize the power of celebration in our lives today? I invite you to turn to the text that we're going to take this morning, which is Luke chapter 14. Luke chapter 14. And the simple task that I have for you this morning is to, as we read this story that Jesus tells, I want you to ask yourself, who am I in this story? Of all the characters that appear in this story, which one am I? Which one am I? So Luke chapter 14. We'll start reading in verse 12, but just to give a little bit of a background, Jesus and his ministry is transitioning from Galilee, where he began his ministry, towards Judea, and specifically Jerusalem. Jesus sets his eyes on Jerusalem because he knows that it's in Jerusalem where the culmination of his earthly ministry is going to take place. He's going to go to the cross where he will die for the forgiveness of sins, and he will be resurrected on the third day. And so Jesus has that path in mind, and he's making his way down that path to Jerusalem. And as he's on his way, he's healing people, he's preaching, he's teaching, he's doing a lot of different things, but he finds himself the guest in the house of a prominent Pharisee in Luke chapter 14. And at this Pharisee's house, not only does he heal a man on the Sabbath, which in and of itself is fairly, it's fairly radical. Jesus also notices that the people who are coming into the house to be seated for this party, a lot of them are picking the places of honor. So they're looking for places that maybe would be close to the master of the household, places where they would have direct contact with the most important person there, which would have been the prominent Pharisee. Jesus notices that people are looking for these places of honor, and Jesus talks to them about how it's important not to choose the places of honor, but rather to prefer a humble position, a place of humility, and to seat yourself and to seek out places of humility. that way, if the person whose house you're entering wants you to sit closer to them, they will bring you from that place of humility to a place of honor. Otherwise, if you sit in a place of honor, but the person whose house you're invited to didn't mean for you to sit there, they're going to move you from a place of honor to a place of humility. So Jesus is just trying to give them this idea that humility is something that we should value. And so the way of humility actually ends up avoiding humiliation. There's a difference. And it actually leads to honor. Humility leads to honor. In the same way, he says that the guests that we invite into our earthly homes, to our earthly celebrations, should be of low status, and this keeps our motives in the kingdom of God pure, because these are people who cannot pay us back, who cannot return anything to us, whether that is by inviting us into their homes or somehow through that connection making us more privileged and more respected in the community. And so Jesus is telling us that it's important to not only be humble, but to associate with those who are humble. So all of that, I say all of that to say this. Jesus is going to move on to a different story that I think is vitally important for our spiritual lives. It says in chapter 14, verse 14, verse 15, excuse me. One of those at the table with Jesus heard this, all those things that he had said about humility. And he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Now Jesus has just said in verse 14, even though those humble people can't repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And so the two things that we begin this story with are Jesus talking about the resurrection of the righteous, and this random guest at the table saying, now that's going to be a feast. You know, when we enter into the kingdom of God and we're sitting around a table there, that's going to be a real celebration. And anybody who's at that feast is truly blessed. So it's this resurrection picture of the feast in God's kingdom. Well, Jesus then will begin to talk about feasts and celebration. But I want you to just think about that imagery for a second. A feast in the kingdom of God. A feast in our resurrected state. What would that be like? What would it be like to sit around the table and bump elbows with Abraham? Or sit across from the table from Moses? Or maybe even sit right next to Jesus himself? Can you imagine yourself in that position? Can you imagine eating and drinking and celebrating with these people of faith whose stories have inspired us to be better, to be more like Christ, to live our lives not by sight but by faith? Can you imagine yourself at that feast? Well, Jesus' response to this man's statement is a story. So let's read that. Jesus says in verse 16, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first one said, 'I just bought a field and I have to go see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' And a third said, 'Well, I just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master, and the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Well, go out quickly into the streets and the alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there's still room.' And then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet." So this story begins with this man, this master of a house, who is holding a feast. He's going to prepare this big celebration, and no expense has been spared. And it comes time to invite guests into the celebration. And so he sends a servant out to invite these people who presumably are people of good reputation. These are people who deserve to come to the feast. They're people with connections. And these are people that the master wants to be there. Unfortunately, though, and to the servant's dismay, all of these people who are invited to enter into celebration with the master, they all refuse. They all turn down the invitation. None of them are willing to celebrate. Now, they all give an excuse as to why they can't show up. You know, and it seems like they're just too busy with bigger, better business things or bigger and better personal things. I just bought a field. I got to go check it out. Well, hey, it's nighttime. I want you to come to a party. You can't even see the field. Yeah, but I got to go look at the field. I just bought 5 pairs of oxen. Well, okay, but, you know, you can test drive those oxen. You can try them out later on. The oxen will be in the stables. They're not going anywhere. Yeah, but I got to go test them out. Well, I just got married, so I can't come. You know, none of these are really good excuses. None of them are really valid excuses, which leads you to believe that there's something underneath the surface here. There's a reason why these people do not want to celebrate. There's a reason why they are reluctant to enter into this celebration. Is it their pride? Is it their ego? Is it their pretentiousness? Do they really think that these other things are just too important, and so they take precedence over the celebration? We're not really sure, but we can definitely relate to them, because I guarantee you that you and I have been, at some point in our lives, invited to a party, invited to a celebration that somebody worked hard on, and we didn't really want to go. And I bet we found a way to get out of going. We found some excuse, some reason that we couldn't show up. But oftentimes the real reasons behind those excuses reveal to us a much deeper problem. That our issues have to do with our heart. That we don't really want to go because we don't actually like the person who's inviting us. Maybe we don't go because we don't like what we're celebrating. Or maybe we don't go because we don't like the other guests who are invited. Either way, oftentimes it's our pretentiousness, it's our pride that doesn't allow us to enter into the act of celebration. It's our self-importance, which ties in with the humility that Jesus has already said is very important. If we lack that humility, that will make us reluctant to celebrate, to sing, to dance, to feast, to enjoy the company of others. What if it was God's banquet that we were invited to, though? The Jews who Jesus was talking to almost inevitably understood what Jesus was trying to say here. That they, as Jews and Pharisees nonetheless, had been the guests of honor at God's banquet. But they had been finding these other important things to do. Well, in that case, God is going to invite other people to the banquet. People who are just in the streets, random people, not even just random people, people who are unclean. crippled, poor, blind, lame, people who normally Pharisees wouldn't associate with. Well, Jesus is kind of in a way saying, those are the people who are going to be invited to the banquet. You see, the banquet for first century Jews oftentimes had this connotation of the Messiah's feast. This is the banquet that the people who were there for the Messiah restoring the kingdom of Israel, they would be invited. It's a feast that you did not want to miss. But Jesus is saying there's going to be some people who should be there but aren't. Let me ask you then, if you are given the invitation to celebrate, are you ever reluctant to enter into that? Are you ever, having been asked to celebrate, find yourself saying, I don't really want to. I don't want to go be with those people. I don't want to celebrate that. I don't want to be there for that. I don't want to be present for that celebration. And whether that is a birthday party or a dinner or it's corporate worship and things get a little bit too spiritual, too real, or it's the Lord's Supper and we just turn the Lord's Supper into something that's so somber and so formal that it doesn't feel like it's actually a celebration of Jesus' sacrifice. Whatever celebration it is that we're talking about, what does our reaction to the invitation tell us about ourselves and reveal to us about ourselves? What more important things could possibly occupy our time? Celebration and the ability to celebrate is vitally important, not just to our lives in connection with other people, the relationships that we have. We need to start seeing from this parable that the ability to celebrate is vital to the spiritual life of a Christian, to the spiritual life of God's children. And so could that reluctance to engage in celebration actually be something that Jesus is addressing through this story? You know, what does it say about our faith? What does it say about us as people if we don't enjoy celebration? Now, if some of you are hearing this and you're saying, well, you know, I'm not really into parties. I'm not really into dinners. I definitely don't like to dance. Let me tell you, that was me for years and years. And even now I struggle with that. When we get invited to a party, part of me wants to say, I'm not really into that kind of thing. But that's so self-focused. That's another thing that I realized in Mexico, that parties there aren't about the person who's being celebrated. They're about the people who are doing the celebrating. There's another Bible story, I think, that really fleshes this out for us. And we're not going to turn there, but I'll kind of give you an idea of what it says. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 6, and the backstory is the Ark of the Covenant is coming into Jerusalem because David has finally conquered the city of Jerusalem. And so they're bringing the Ark to the holy city, and there's shouting, and there is sacrifice of animals, there's dancing, there's people blowing on trumpets. And in verse 5 of 2 Samuel 6, it says that David, so the king, who's usually wearing a crown, sitting on a throne, David is in the streets, dancing before the Lord with all his might. Dancing with all his might. I love that image. So trumpets are blaring, people are shouting for joy, animals are being sacrificed. It is not just a party, it is a celebration. It is a recognition of God's glory and God's goodness and His presence and His protection over His people. And God's people are celebrating this reality. And David is right there in the thick of it, wearing only a linen ephod, and he's dancing with all his might. no reluctance in David's heart to celebrate with the people. But not everyone who is there is enjoying the festivities. Later on in verse 16 it says that King Saul's daughter Michal, who was one of David's wives, that she was watching the celebration from a window. That through a window she could see what King David was doing. And I want you to notice her location. She's not at the party. She's not in the midst of the celebration. She's observing it from a distance. She's not willing to get close and to enter into the act of celebration. She's in a safe place. A place that is safe for her comfort zone. A place that is safe for her reputation. A place that is safe for her ego. You get what I'm saying? Why doesn't she want to join David in the celebration? Is she too proud to dance alongside of him? Is she too good to shout at the top of her lungs with the regular people? As she watched David celebrate, it says that she despised him in her heart. Oftentimes when we're on the outside of the act of celebration, it's easy to look inside and kind of look at people who are on their knees praying to God, hands raised to the heavens, or beating their breasts. Or maybe you're just at a birthday party and everybody else is dancing and you're looking at everybody doing that and you're just saying, what are they doing? It's easy to despise the people who are celebrating when you find yourself outside of the celebration. And she goes on to basically tell him, you've made a fool of yourself and you look like a fool, but the slave girls, the servant girls, I'm sure they enjoyed it. And David's response to Michal is classic. He says, I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. What is David saying? He's saying, if I'm celebrating and I'm rejoicing and I'm worshiping God, then I'm willing to become even more humiliated. I'm willing to look even more foolish than this. And not to mention the slave girls who you despise and said are enjoying this, at least they're celebrating. At least they have entered into this act of worship. At least they understood why David was dancing and they honored him for it. Well, back to Jesus' story. This reluctance for the guests to come angers the master of the house because he's prepared it and he's let no expense be spared. But these people won't show up. They won't celebrate it. And so he says to himself, I might as well invite the people who do want to celebrate, who do value this thing that I've prepared and planned for. And so in this case, the people who will show up are the rabble, the unclean, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame, who were scattered throughout the streets of the town, found in alleyways and dark places in the city. They show up, and yet there's even more room to spare at this party. And I think that that's a good place in the story to stop and ask ourselves, who are we in this story? In both a very tangible, real sense, in a worldly, earthly sense, who are we? Do we regularly enter into the act of celebration with our friends, with our family, with our church? Or are we reluctant to enter into that? Who are we in this story spiritually? Are we like those who found a reason not to go to the banquet? Or are we one of the others? Maybe, and I hate to say this, but maybe we're the excuse makers. I definitely have been. Maybe we're the reluctant homebodies, the too busy business people, the skeptical window watchers. That was me for so long. At any Mexican celebration, that was me. Not only did I not enjoy the celebration, but I despised the fact that other people could enjoy it so much until I humbled myself and joined. And then I learned to love it, to enjoy it, to celebrate. And it was a wonderful thing. It took risk, but it was so worth it. Maybe we are one of the poor, crippled, blind, or lame. Honestly, they're the real guests of honor. They're the ones who Jesus describes to the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, saying, "The true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." That's who God's really looking for. The ones who are not worried about their ego, not worried about their pride or their reputation or how they look to others. Jesus calls them the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of God. This is who we need to be. I'm convinced that we need to be these people in the real world, which means if you're invited to a party, go and enjoy what's being celebrated. But I think especially spiritually, we need to be these people who drink deeply from the well of worship, who enjoy the act of celebrating together, whether that is a potluck after church or the Lord's Supper, where we are celebrating the reality that Jesus gave himself so that we could have a place at the table. He gave up his place so that we could have our own place. Yasmin tells a story about when she was a kid. One of her brothers had a birthday party, and none of the kids from their colonia, from their neighborhood, showed up. And so her dad said, "I'll be back in a little bit." And he drove to the neighboring colonia that was noticeably poorer, where the streets weren't paved. And he had a minivan, and he told all the kids in the colonia, "Come over here. I want to take you guys to a party." And the kids came running, filled up the van, 15 or 20 kids in the back of this minivan. And they went and they enjoyed the cake and they hit the piñata, and the party was a huge success. And so in conclusion, the ability to celebrate, the ability to enjoy, to savor, to be present in those moments is vital to our spiritual life. It's vital to our soul. If we lose that ability, not only do we become stiff, do we become bored, do we become dry, do we become detached, but we risk becoming a guest who uninvites himself from the party, who uninvites himself from the celebration. And so if Jesus were here right now, inviting you to the table, would you feast with him? Would you dance with him? Would you sing a hymn with him? Would you lean up against him? Would you recline on him at the table? The same way that they did at the Passover. At the Passover, they ate together. One of Jesus' disciples leaned up against them. They sang a hymn together. Imagine the laughter. Imagine the joy. Imagine the good moments that they shared. Now, there was a Judas at the table who was detached from the celebration, but there were other disciples there completely enjoying the presence of Jesus. But imagine that there's an empty place at that Passover table, too. There's room to spare. Will we fill that